Hi everyone and welcome to the Arkham Seeker. Today in this video I'll show you how to build decks for the librarian Daisy Walker, the second investigator in the game's core set. This video will follow the same structure as my other deck building guides. First, I'll explain the basic characteristics of Daisy as an investigator, for which I'll carefully read her investigator card and her signature cards, and then I'll do a basic analysis of her strengths and weaknesses in order to identify her key characteristics. Once we know Daisy well as an investigator, I'll discuss the basic strategies for building her decks, and I'll do it by indicating which cards she can use to achieve what is needed to consistently win the game, such as clue gathering, dealing with enemies, and defending herself. Finally, I'll take you to the Arkham DB webpage and show you different example decks for Daisy, both made by me and by other content creators. So without further ado, let's start analyzing the main characteristics of Daisy Walker as an investigator. Daisy Walker, the librarian, is a Seeker class investigator with 3 willpower, 5 intellect, 2 combat, and 2 agility. She has an additional action on each of her turns, which can only be used to activate an action ability on a Tome asset she controls. The elder sign for her is a +0 and lets us draw a card for each Tome asset we control. She has 5 health and 9 sanity. Her deck size is 30 and can include cards of Seeker class level 0 to 5, Mystic 0 to 2, and Neutral 0 to 5. Additionally, she must include her tote bag, the Necronomicon, and the random basic weakness. Her signature card is Daisy's tote bag, a 2-cost asset with willpower, intellect, and wild icons. It's an item, and it says that we have 2 additional hand slots, which can only be used to hold Tome assets. On the other hand, her personal weakness is the Necronomicon, beyond this translation. It's an asset, item, tome, occupies 1 hand, and when revealed, must be placed in her threat area with 3 horror on it. It says that we must treat each Elder Sign token we reveal as an automatic failure token. For 1 action, we can move 1 horror from this card to Daisy Walker, and then if this card has no horror on it, it's discarded. And remember that this is a Tome asset controlled by Daisy, so she can use her extra action to activate it. However, this card is not an encounter card, and this means that other investigators at Daisy's location cannot activate this ability, as you can only activate abilities on encounter cards at other players' threat areas. Okay, let's move into the strengths and weaknesses of Daisy Walker, starting with her main strengths. Her main strength is that she is an excellent clue-gathering character. She has a very high base intellect and full access to Seeker class. This allows her to investigate almost any location in the game, only needing a slight skill boost for the locations with a high shroud value. Then she has partial access to Mystic class, which is a class that offers many ways to control the game, such as cancelling or ignoring encounter effects. This grants Daisy a quite needed defense ability, as her weakest point is defending herself. Finally, she has an extra action to activate a Tome ability. Actions are the most valuable resource in the game, so having an extra action, even if its use is limited, is always powerful. Moreover, even the core set includes several Tome assets that can be activated with this extra action that provide a quite significant advantage, which we'll see in the next chapter. That sums up Daisy's strongest points, but what are her main weak points? The most important is that her health is very low, with only 5 points. This makes Daisy very vulnerable to enemies and damage-dealing treacheries. Also, her agility is quite low, so she can take damage very easily. For this reason, physical defense is extremely important for Daisy and must be covered when building her decks. Then, as I've already mentioned, she's quite vulnerable to enemies, as she doesn't have many ways for dealing damage nor for evading. For this reason, Daisy is a character that must be actively defended and protected by her teammates, at least if you don't have a big collection of cards from the different expansions that could add some ways for Daisy to deal with enemies. In general, I consider Daisy a low-complexity investigator. She is the reference clue-gathering character, and it's a quite easy character to build. You only need to rely on a high base intellect, boost it a little bit, and defend yourself. Even her main characteristic, which is the extra action for activating a tome, is very easy to understand and to optimize. Obviously, she's a very strong clue gatherer, but a very poor fighter and evader. Finally, her physical defense is dangerously low, and her mental defense is quite high, as she has a very high sanity and access to Mystic class. As always, this analysis has covered Daisy's main strengths and weaknesses, and has given us the required information to design a strategy for building her decks. So now we are going to analyze these strategies for building Daisy's decks, and we'll do it by studying how Daisy can achieve the basic tasks that are needed to consistently win the game, which are the ones you are seeing now on the screen. I remind you that unless you are playing true solo, controlling one single character, you don't need that your character is good at all of these 4 areas. In particular, you don't need to be a good clue gatherer and a good enemy manager at the same time. This is more important regarding your team composition, where you always need a fighter and a clue gatherer, at least one of each. In this case, Daisy should specialize on what she is good, which is gathering clues, although she could use a few cards for enemy management to not depend on her teammates at all times. So let's go back and start analyzing the deck building strategies for Daisy, starting with clue gathering. Which cards can help Daisy to find clues? Daisy shouldn't have any problems investigating almost any location in the game, thanks to her high intellect. However, in the case of high shroud locations, we still need a slight skill boost, which can be granted with static boosts, like Dr. Milan Christopher, probably the best seeker ally in the early life of the game, as he boosts our intellect and generates almost endless resources, as his reaction ability can be triggered multiple times in your turn. That's why he was modified in the taboo list. Then the second key for consistently beating the Chaos Bug after boosting your skill is action compression, as the less skill tests you take, the less you depend on the Chaos Bug and the more action efficient you are. For this reason, deduction is a clear staple in almost all clue gathering characters, as it can give us 2 clues from a single investigation. Again, one of the keys for consistently beating the Chaos Bug is boosting your skill. In the case of clue gathering characters, you can use the magnifying glass, which is a very cheap static boost, which is only valid for investigating but can be amortized pretty easily, as investigate actions are very common in clue gathering characters. Finally, if you can use cards that grant direct clues without investigating or spending actions, you can also accelerate your clue gathering job. So, Working a Hunch can be a good card even in Daisy's decks, although this card is usually better in characters that are not as good finding clues. It's still viable in specialist clue gatherers, although they will find better alternatives in expansions. Let's jump into the enemy management area. Which cards can be used by Daisy to deal with enemies? If you only have a revised core set or 2 old core sets, the only good option you have for Daisy is Mind Over Matter, which lets you use your intellect instead of your combat and your agility for the remainder of the round. This should be used to evade more than to fight, as most enemies have more than 1 health, and a basic attack is a very weak action, as it only deals 1 damage. You will need several basic attacks to defeat an enemy, and that is a very bad strategy. However, this card can be used to evade, which only costs one action, although does not defeat the enemy, but gives you a bit of breathing room until the team can defeat the enemy, or you could even leave it behind in some cases. As I said, this card is the only good option you have in the core set if you want Daisy to effectively deal with enemies. So, in this particular case, I'll show you a couple alternative cards that you can find in the Dunwich Legacy expansion, which offers several ways for Seekers to deal with enemies. The first one is the I've Got a Plan card, which is an event that can attack for up to 4 damage if you have at least 3 clues. It's a very powerful card in the right context, as it hits very hard and lets you use Daisy's best skill to attack, which is the intellect. A great option if you want Daisy a bit more agency to deal with enemies. Then you can also use the Inquiring Mind card to boost any skill if your location has clues, which for Daisy is always desirable. This card is more useful to evade than to fight, for the reason I said before, as basic attacks, basic fight actions are too weak, but a basic evade action can temporarily disable the enemy, and that should be enough to buy Daisy some time to keep investigating until her friends come to actually fight and defeat the enemy. Finally, if you can spare a few experience points, you can buy the upgraded Strange Solution, Acidic Ichor variant, which is a very strong option if you want to give Daisy some combat options. Let's go into the defensive area. Which cards can be used by Daisy to defend herself from the mythos? Here we should use her access to Mystic cards, which offer many ways to control the game. One of the most basic cards is the Word of Protection, which can cancel any treachery card you draw at the cost of 1 horror point, which for Daisy is not a big deal. Just try to save this card for a real danger, such as a card that threatens to damage Daisy, as her low health is her weakest point. Then you could use the medical text Tome to heal damage. Just be careful when using it, as if you fail the test, you actually damage your target. Thankfully, it shouldn't happen very often, as Daisy has a quite high intellect and she should pass the test quite easily. Another option is to boost your willpower in order to defend yourself from most treachery cards, as most of them test your willpower. The Holy Rosary is a very strong defensive card, as it's cheap, offers a static boost, and shields you for 2 horror. Finally, the best option you can find within the core set to defend Daisy is the Bulletproof Vest, as it acts as a damage shield that almost doubles Daisy's health. This is similar to the Elder Sign Amulet for Roland. It's not cheap in terms of experience points, but it's a solid defense for Daisy. Let's finish with the area I denominate Synergies, where I'll mention several cards that have a good synergy with Daisy and that I have not mentioned in the 3 previous areas. The most important synergy for Daisy is the use of Tome Assets that can be triggered by action, as she has an extra action each turn to activate one of these abilities. The core set offers several Tome Assets that are designed for Daisy, and the most valuable, in my opinion, is the Old Book of Lore. It offers an ability that grants a filter card draw to any investigator at Daisy's location. As it's free to activate quoting with Daisy's extra action, it provides a good card advantage for almost no cost. Then you can use the Research Librarian to search for any tome you need in your deck. In general, you want to play him early, ideally before playing Mylan Christopher, and use it to find the Old Book of Lore. Finally, there's an upgraded card that is also a Tome asset, which is the Encyclopedia. It can boost any investigator's ability at Daisy's location by 2 until the end of the round, which can be good if you manage to find a good target. And don't forget that Daisy can activate it with her extra action. So, like the Old Book of Lore, it has no opportunity cost, so you can take a great advantage from it. This concludes the first part of the video. As always, I hope I've managed to explain the basic strategies for building good decks for Daisy, and now I'm going to show you a couple example decks. Let's go to the Arkham DB webpage, where I'll show you several example decks for Daisy. Okay, here we are at the ArkhamDB webpage, ready for the second part of the video. Here I'll show you a couple example decks for Daisy, using only a revised core set. Today this will be very brief, as if you only have a revised core set, Daisy's decks are fairly easy to optimize. It doesn't matter how many players are in the game, as Daisy's decks will work well if their aspect is something like this. This is my personal proposal for a reference Daisy deck, which you can find at this video's description. The main idea is very clear. We want to boost our intellect a little bit, using cards like Magnifying Glass or Dr. Malan Christopher, and then we need to defend ourselves as best as possible. Also, we want to find and play the old book of lore as early as possible, in order to use Daisy's extra action to activate a Tome action ability. Besides that, there's nothing much to do. Just investigate frequently and defend yourself as you can, although you depend a bit on your fighting teammates to actually defeat enemies. This deck has a couple ways of defending against enemies, such as Mind Over Matter and Stripling, but they are far from optimal, so you still depend on your teammates to actually defeat enemies. As always, you have a longer description of the deck at the right of the screen, although I'm just repeating what I said at the first part of the video. You have a general upgrade plan using the core set cards and a couple alternatives if you have expansions. Then I'll only be showing you one more deck made by other content creators. The reason why I'm only showing you this additional deck is because, as you can see, it's almost a carbon copy of my own deck. There's only one card that I've not included in my deck nor mentioned in the video, which is the Blinding Light, a mystic event that can evade an enemy using your willpower and even damage it a bit, although it can cost you an action. I generally dislike this card, in particular for Daisy, as she has better alternatives to evade, but it's still viable if you want to give her another way of dealing with enemies. Besides that, and besides a couple changes in the skill cards, as the deck uses Fearless and Manual Dexterity, the deck is the same. I prefer to use Unexpected Courage, as it's a more flexible card, although it doesn't give you a card draw, but both alternatives are perfectly valid. I could show you a couple more decks, but from my point of view, they deviate too much from what I found to be optimal for Daisy if we limit ourselves to the revised core set. So that's all for today. I hope I've managed to express myself well and that you have learned at least something from this video. And I'll see you at the next deck building guide, where I'll continue with the core set investigators and talk about the XCon Skits O'Toole. So thanks for watching, till we meet again here at the Arkham Seeker.